what 9/11 did is, combined with a general Greenspan libertarian philosophy about bank regulation, took bank cops into terrorism. So literally the number of FBI agents who were attuned to financial frauds were switched over to looking for terrorists that are going to bomb the next World Trade Center.
People have, though, they have to speak up and they have to say something, because people are dying as a result. I mean, we're not talking about, $10 here. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars. I mean, going to terrorists and drug cartels. And what I don't think people don't understand about this banking scandal is that it's not really a banking scandal. It's a war. I mean, this is a very real war, and wars are financed with money.
What we find and what we believe is that the maximizing of profit, the desire to maximize profit by HSBC, did not amount to a complicit hand-in-hand working relationship with the cartels. What we find is they really weren't concerned about where the money was coming from at all, whether it was coming from a drug organization or a human smuggling organization or an arms smuggling organization. These were questions that weren't being asked because they were reaping a lot of profit.
In 2010, September, the OCC issued a supervisory letter, 31 pages long, describing a long list of severe anti-money laundering deficiencies, and followed in October 2010 with a cease and desist order requiring HBUS to revamp its anti-money laundering program a second time.
I started working at HSBC October 10th of 2010, and then 3 weeks in November, that was when I sent the CIA my first email, notifying them of what was occurring. So it was for 3 weeks in I started, and then I was passing information to the CIA for about a year. So HSBC was issued the cease and desist order right before I got there. And I was part of the cleanup crew, and I saw, terrorist financing and very suspicious activity. And management, they just wanted the problem to go, really interested in stopping it, or if anything, they were facilitating it. And it was a national security issue, so I took it as HSBC was my enemy, and so were the people working there, because they were, through the click of a mouse, they were responsible for, funding terrorists and killing innocent people. And, yeah. HSBC wanted to defraud the United States government, and HSBC did so by selling off their credit card division to Capital One. And HSBC took a whole bunch of these debt collectors that they had working for them, fired them, and then rehired them as anti-money laundering compliance officers. So even now, you have hundreds of debt collectors approving transactions on behalf of HSBC who have no idea what they're doing. And they went and showed the government, HSBC went and showed the government that we have this huge compliance program when the whole thing's a sham. There is no compliance program. What I saw there was criminal manipulation of the wire filter. OFAC has a list of companies and people that the bank can't do business with. So those names are listed in an actual wire filter. So they would put dots and dashes in the codings, which the FBI later called stripping the payments. And that was how, the hundreds by millions of dollars, were able to finance Hezbollah and the drug cartels. They would criminally manipulate the wire filter. So this is something I notified the CIA about. It's a real problem. I mean, because if you have, a Zeta drug cartel member on there and they just put a dot or a dash in and then he gets all the money, what's the point of the AML program? There is no point. What HSBC did, though, to further defraud the government was they ended up getting rid of AMS, the alert monitoring system, and replaced it with Norcom. And Norcom was a web-based alert clearing application. But what was different between the two softwares was that Norcom allowed you to clear bulk alerts. So you could clear just as many as possible. I mean, it was unbelievable how many you could clear. And that was important because they couldn't have a backlog. And that was the name of the game, to clear as many alerts as possible. In fact, we had to clear 72 a week. They actually put limits or minimums on how many alerts we had to clear. So, because if they went into a backlog, the government could investigate and it would be a problem. I will not stop until they are in jail. Someone has to be held accountable for this. You can't give millions of dollars to a terrorist organization and then get in your BMW and then go eat a lobster dinner. It just doesn't, that's not the way America is supposed to be, and that's not the way the world is supposed to be. It's not the, responsibility of a bank and
Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Although it is difficult to measure with precision, by any estimate, the total amount of dirty money moved through and concealed within the U.S. financial system is massive, in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The sheer volume of money moving through the banking system in particular makes banks both the most vulnerable financial institutions for money laundering and terrorist financing and the most important line of defense against money laundering and terrorist financing.
HSBC Mexico, or HBMX, operates in a high-risk country battling drug cartels. It has had high-risk clients, such as Casas de Cambios, and it has offered high-risk products, such as U.S. dollar accounts in the Cayman Islands, a jurisdiction known for secrecy and money laundering.
The investigation revealed that through decentralization of operations, HSBC's different branches and different divisions operated completely autonomously and did not communicate to each other information about accounts that one branch believed suspicious, so that a large volume of money was able to be transferred. We believe that the majority of money that was being moved from Mexico into the United States consisted of proceeds from drug cartels.
HBUS treated HB Mexico as such a low-risk client bank that it didn't even monitor their account activity for suspicious transactions. In addition, for 3 years, from mid-2006 to mid-2009, HBUS conducted no monitoring of a banknotes account used by HB Mexico to physically deposit billions of U.S. dollars from clients.
The Casa de Cambio system in Mexico is one that is much less regulated, certainly than the U.S. banking system. And there is where the cartels would normally deposit their proceeds. A lot less scrutiny and a lot easier for the Casa de Cambio to move money into the banking system.
Some of those Casas de Cambios had accounts at HB Mexico, which in turn took all the physical dollars that it got transported them by armored car or aircraft back across the border to HBUS for deposit in its U.S. banknotes account, completing the laundering cycle. Over 2 years, from 2007 to 2008, HBMX shipped $7 billion in physical U.S. dollars to HBUS. That was more than any other Mexican bank, even one twice HBMX's size.
What started to occur was, because of the lack of scrutiny on the accounts with HSBC, rather than go through that first step and use a Casa de Cambio as a middleman, they started to go directly to HSBC because it allowed them to get their money into the banking system immediately without scrutiny. What we found is that out of all the banks operating in Mexico during this time period, HSBC provided the least amount of scrutiny and allowed the maximum amount of flexibility for drug cartels to launder their proceeds.
Las filiales de bancos extranjeros que consideramos como banca mexicana, pues no han sido
The subsidiaries of foreign banks, considered as an integral part of the Mexican banking system, were not a problem. On the contrary, they were part of the solution for Mexico, as long as they remained profitable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. We saw them as part of the solution and not the problem. To date, the controls carried out on the Mexican financial system have proved adequate to ensure the honor, the legitimacy, and above all, confidence in the Mexican financial system.
There were a number of different financial instruments used by these organizations through HSBC Bank to move those illicit proceeds from Mexico into the United States, into the Cayman Islands, and really throughout the world. HSBC's operation in the Caymans had virtually no employees, almost no physical space, yet more than 50,000 accounts containing over $2 billion. Clearly, that is a red flag. Clearly, that is a major problem.
If the parent corporation of a global bank can't do a better job policing its affiliates, we shouldn't be providing a bank charter to their U.S. affiliate. If the U.S. affiliate can't do a better job of standing up to affiliate pressures and safeguarding the U.S. financial system, federal regulators should consider whether to pull its charter.
And while our focus has been on the problems we found at HSBC Bank, we also have to emphasize that similar problems exist at other banks. For example, Citibank, Bank of America, Wachovia, Western Union, and others have come under scrutiny for laundering drug cartel profits.
As we've done these cases in the last 2.5 years, absolutely without question, we have had somebody basically involved in every bank that has ignored the warning signs of what they're seeing. And one of the reasons is the high commission. It's like anything else, money talks.
The standard going rate for money laundering is about 20%. So if I come in with $1 million worth of cash, you'll want $200,000 as a fee for putting it in the bank. That beats by far the amount of money that they can make off your credit card.
Who's making consistently the most amount of money and not being molested is that individual that's moving the money. That these people are educated, they're white collar, they have gone to college, sometimes Harvard, Yale, and they see themselves as business people. They don't have the tat on the neck, and they don't ever expect to see prison.
We deeply regret and apologize for the fact that HSBC did not live up to our own expectations, the expectations of our regulators, our customers, our employees, and the general public. HSBC's compliance history, as examined today, is unacceptable.
My view on this would be that we would give to any government as much information as we're legally permitted to do when we get a valid request. So I can't tell you whether there would be some legal restriction, but we would do everything we could to get them the information.
Well, when you say what you're legally permitted to do, were you legally permitted by the Caymans, by their law, to provide this? Do you know Cayman law won't allow this? They're a secrecy jurisdiction.
I don't know, Senator.
Well, but you need to find out.
Pardon me? What?
Are you going to be bound by a secrecy jurisdiction's law that says you can't share that information? I mean, if you're going to say, if legally permitted by the Caymans or by any other country, you got tax havens and so forth with secrecy jurisdictions, Caymans being one of them. Are you bound by that? Are you going to work with law enforcement, or are you going to be bound by Caymans?
We're going to do everything we can to cooperate with law enforcement.
Well, you say, though, that if it's legally permitted, that's your hedge word. U.S. law binds you to report to OFAC. What are you going to do? Live up to Cayman law or U.S. law?
I don't know if there would be a conflict there. I can't get into it.
Assume there is.
If there is, we do everything we can to get it to OFAC.
To comply with U.S. law?
Yes.
You're caught with a little bit of marijuana in the United States, and you're going to go to prison. But you launder $200 trillion worth of money. You enable drugs to come in from Mexico. You are a necessary ingredient for murders that take place on the streets of Baltimore over a disagreement about the drug. And somehow, your company is allowed to pay what is, in effect, a library overdue fine. $2 billion, $1.9 billion. That's really 1 month's profit of HSBC.
And the bank itself paid a fine, but the fine did not come from the pockets, for the most part, of the people involved, the employees of the bank, the officers of the bank, but from the shareholders of the bank, who were not involved in any direct way in the bad conduct of the bank.
Department of Justice and the Treasury just sent a huge message to the banks. They said to them, you can do whatever you want and you're not going to jail. So the next financial crisis or the next thing they do is going to be 100 times worse. And that's what I'm afraid of. It's that message of they can just do whatever they want, and they can't.
I think the single best insight into a company's fortunes and how it's understood by knowledgeable people is that share price. So I think it says a lot that HSBC stock goes up after it settled for this terrible thing, after it admitted this terrible thing. That means it wasn't terrible. I mean, what it did was terrible, but the accountability was what we think is borderline meaningless.
There's not immaculate conception of crimes at corporations. If a corporation has committed a crime, necessarily human beings have committed the crime as well. If there was ever a bank that should have been simply put out of business as a penalty for violation of the laws, HSBC, because in addition to the money laundering, which was stunning in how flagrant it was, and the fact that they were laundering billions of dollars. This was not one or two rogue employees of HSBC. It was conduct that involved many people in the bank and had to have gone to a fairly high level to launder billions of dollars, and who they were laundering the money for. The financial crisis may have set a tone in the Department of Justice and with the American government generally of worrying about the fragility of the international financial system, and that banks of the size and the scale, the interconnectedness of HSBC made them very reluctant to bring criminal prosecutions, certainly against the bank itself, which might have required that their charter be revoked, which would put them out of business. For a bank of that size simply to go out of business would be very disruptive of the American economy and of the world economy, certainly the financial system.
If you decide you cannot bring the full force of the law for the crime that you found, let's have a public acknowledgement of that. Because if that's the case, if it is too big to jail, then it's too big.
Tell me a little bit about the last few times you've taken the biggest financial institutions on Wall Street all the way to a trial. Anybody? Chairman Curry?
To offer my perspective.
Sure.
We've actually had a fairly fair number of consent orders. We do not have to bring people to in a trial or an
Well, I appreciate that you say you don't have to bring them to trial. My question is, when did you bring them to trial?
We have not had to do it as a practical matter to achieve our supervisory goals.
I'm really concerned that too big to fail has become too big for trial. That just seems wrong to me.
HSBC is the world's, first or second largest bank. If it can't be managed, if they can't control fraud, then it needs to be closed. And if it can't be closed, because the repercussions would send us into the dark ages again, then we actually have no choice but to cut it into slices. Close them, make them do an IPO, but don't make these banks bigger. It's the central problem. If there was one single problem in the United States, and since we have such global reach, it's the fact that our financial institutions are way too big, enormously oversized.
It's bad enough that a single bank, such as HSBC, exposes the U.S. financial system to multiple money laundering risks. It's made worse when there's a failure of anti-money laundering oversight by the regulator which is supposed to oversee our biggest banks, the OCC. It is of great concern to the subcommittee, and it should be of great concern to every American, that the OCC tolerated the mounting anti-money laundering problems at HBUS for 5 years without taking any formal or informal enforcement action.
We've also learned recently that investigators from Treasury's own Office of Inspector General have cited OCC personnel for unethical practices. This, unfortunately, does not seem to be an isolated incident.
I don't think many people do just think corruptly that I'm going to do this to enhance my future, to this bank that has committed this crime may be a future client of a law firm for me in the future, that I may work for in the future, that I may be a partner of in the future. I don't think many people, or perhaps anybody involved, really thinks about it in quite those terms. But the impression from the outside, for the American people and for others, of seeing the top officials at Justice come from big, connected, prominent Washington law firms that have the biggest banks as clients, not criminally prosecute banks in the face of strong evidence of criminal violations, and then the very officials who made those decisions going back to the banks that have those, to the law firms that have those banks as clients, the appearance is terrible.
There's not much contest. Wall Street runs this town. The Republican Party is sort of the business party, and it's pretty easy for them to raise money for business, and politics in America is very much about raising money. One of the few places that the Democratic Party can raise money from is Wall Street. Wall Street does not care about, choice, women's rights, but they care about causing federal insurance and permissions for them to operate with all this federal subsidy. They care about that, so they'll give money to anybody that they think will win or will be in power. Usually, if you look at Wall Street money, it goes as much to D's as it does to R's. Wall Street spends $2.4 million a day lobbying. That's just with those 3,000 lobbyists. For every one of me, there's 150 Wall Street lobbyists. Now, we can't say the money bought, but we can just say that's a fact. The fight is Wall Street versus Main Street. Wall Street has won the battle of Washington. What Treasury and Justice are worried about is calming both the markets and their relationship with the English, the London regulators, in this case, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, who's going to be a little upset that American regulators are penalizing British banks. Why they would be concerned, I don't know, because maybe British regulators could penalize American banks, who, of course, the venue of choice for swaps trading right now is London.
From Wall Street to the Schengen area, the traffickers export their model. As an avid consumer of white powder, Europe is the new front line in the war on drugs.
Where there's drugs, there's cartels, and there's money. You cannot bury your head and pretend it's not there. It's there. There is a problem, you gotta admit it, and now find a solution. The fact that you don't see a drug lord in the front of the bank doesn't mean that they're not there. Drug money is in Europe. Europe is invaded.
There is a link between the violence that drug gangs were perpetuating in Mexico and the international financial system and the UK. So HSBC admitted to taking over $800 million from drug cartels in Latin America. What we know is during the time that HSBC were taking that money, 35,000 people died at the hands of the drug gangs.
London is one of the biggest financial centres in the world. And is probably number 2 after New York. We have a range of markets here that people from offshore jurisdictions can invest or make investments in, credit default swaps, and other types of financial derivative instruments.
Now, in the UK, there's legislation at the moment to stop banks taking dirty money. The real problem is that legislation isn't enforced. So the UK regulator did a review 3 years ago, which found that 3/4 of banks weren't following their obligations to prevent dirty money being put through the bank.
The more sophisticated gangs of organised criminals around the world, it would be naive not to think that they don't regularly, successfully launder some of the proceeds of their organised criminal activities through the London markets. I mean, those monies or those proceeds will have entered a foreign banking system somewhere. But here in the UK, we've licensed 580 banks, and many of those banks are only licensed to operate in respect of customers who are offshore.
The UK is a significant destination for all sorts of dirty money, whether that's money from tax evasion, from arms smuggling, from terrorism, from drug smuggling. The UK is also at the centre of a web of tax havens. So the UK's overseas territories and crown dependencies are very vulnerable to money laundering and tax evasion, and they filter their money into the UK financial system. So a lot of money from Jersey, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and all the British overseas territories and crown dependencies does come through the UK. So weaknesses in the systems of those jurisdictions mean there's weaknesses for the UK as well.
You know, are we seeing a little less of the Caribbean islands? I would say yes, and more towards Europe and the Middle East.
There's a real concern that property in London is being bought by dirty money. A property in London is a very attractive proposition for any investor around the world. There's a very high return on investment, which means that it's also going to be an attractive investment for dirty money. And you know, research has found that lots of expensive property in the UK and in London is owned by anonymous shell companies. It's very easy, it's all too easy to set up an anonymous companies. There are organisations called company service providers, which will set up companies for you. Most people assume that it's the sunny Caribbean islands that are the worst offenders, so the likes of the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands and others. But actually, company service providers in the US are the most willing to take dirty money without doing the checks. And the UK and its tax havens are the second of offenders. The UK announced that it's going to pass legislation which will require the real true owners of companies to be identified, and that's a really significant step. But we need to make sure those laws are enforced and the quality of information is right.
Financial Action Task Force estimates that between 2 and 5% of any country's gross domestic product represents the proceeds of criminal conduct. The International Monetary Fund estimates that another 11% of a European country's gross domestic product represents the proceeds of the shadow economy.
Probably within the next 2 to 3 years, most experts agree that for the first time ever, there will be more cocaine destined for European markets than will be coming into the United States.
If it should go up, then yes, there's a bigger threat to the markets, both here in the United Kingdom, through London, the same as there would be in Germany through Frankfurt.
Europe is flooded with cocaine and marijuana. 100% of the cocaine that's being smuggled is going to be smuggled by the cartels. Either Colombian cartels, you know, or it's going to be Mexican cartels. The presence of Mexican cartels is being well documented. In Spain, arrests of Sinaloa cartel members have been present. Italy, Zeta cartel members have been documented meeting with crime bosses in Italy. So it's well documented. The price of cocaine, it almost doubles per kilo what it costs in the U.S.
Since 9/11, there has been a significant decline in the state sponsorship of terrorism around the globe. That's why well over half of the 51 designated terrorist organizations that have been designated by the United States are involved in one or more aspects of the global drug trade now. The business partners for Mexican cartels are any organized crime or terrorist group in the world. They rely on those same shadow facilitators, and that's another reason why this confluence of drugs and terror is so troubling. Oftentimes, they serve as a catalyst for these groups to come together.
Amin Juma. He is a Colombian Lebanese national. He was part of a very large money laundering and narcotics trafficking ring that supplied cocaine to, among other people, the Los Zetas Mexican drug cartel, and then he also laundered the drug proceeds back to the Colombian suppliers of cocaine.
He is very much a shadow facilitator and was heavily involved in designing the Hezbollah's money laundering operations to legitimize or at least move their hundreds of millions of dollars of cocaine money into legitimate financial institutions.
The Lebanese-Canadian bank case. For the first time, the U.S. justice system accused Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite party, of complicity in transnational crime.
It's what we call a trade-based money laundering scheme because it involves not just the movement of money, but it also involves consumer goods. And here it was used cars. Money was transported from Lebanon to the United States. That money went to used car dealers in the United States who bought cars that were shipped to West Africa, to car lots in Benin, West Africa, where the cars were sold. The money from the sale of the cars was commingled with narcotics proceeds from the West African drug trade, and that money was bulk cash smuggled through Europe back to Lebanon, where it would be assisted by Hezbollah, Hezbollah members and operatives who assisted in this process and helped to facilitate the money laundering.
The money generated by drugs and all sorts of illegal trade gets to Lebanon and finds its way into the Lebanese banking system, from where it can be recycled in, let us say, a safe way. I'd say laundering is a national sport. Yes, it's a national sport in Lebanon.
Do we see more money movement to the Middle East? Since I started into my unit 2 years ago, absolutely, we're seeing more money moving to the Middle East. Do I see some Lebanese accounts from time to time? We have. Are they in the same numbers as maybe the Spain or Frankfurt or Switzerland? No, but we are seeing an upsurge in that country in the Middle East, specifically the Middle East.
بالنسبة لنقل الأموال لبنان ما في قانون بيحذر.
In terms of financial transfers, Lebanese laws set no limit on the sums that can go from Lebanon overseas, or the other way. The absence of a limit implies free money circulation to and from Lebanon. And Lebanon is a jurisdiction which applies banking secrecy.
I think we can no longer ignore the dirty money generated by the Shiite community, whether it is in West Africa or South America.
Typically what would happen is when the cash would arrive on flights to Lebanon, in many circumstances, individuals affiliated with Hezbollah would help to get the money off the plane. In fact, there is an instance we mentioned in our complaint where the couriers were called off the plane first and escorted through security so that they could drop the money off, the cash off at Lebanese Canadian Bank. But the cash would go and typically deposited in either an IASH exchange account or an illicit exchange account at Lebanese Canadian Bank. Both of those two exchange houses had substantial bank accounts there. And in fact, the Hassan Ayash exchange was the largest supplier of US currency for Lebanese Canadian Bank. And then that money would then be wire transferred back to the United States, where it would go directly to car buyers.
The amounts of money that were laundered were absolutely staggering, as much as $200 million per month. And when you put that into perspective, the best estimates by the United States and by many other intelligence services around the world, the best estimates is that Iran provides Hezbollah with only about $200 million in funding a year.
A Hezbollah freed from Iranian funding. If the proceeds of crime frees terrorism from dependency on states, would its agenda lead to even greater lawlessness?
Today, with the crises that are sweeping the Arab world, especially in Syria, Lebanon could become more permeable to terrorism financing and arms trafficking.
The circulation of laundered money may be compared to that of arms destined for terrorists, or countries which are carrying out operations on Syrian territory. Arms trafficking is subject to the laws on money laundering.
Hezbollah modernized the Lebanese drug trade in terms of growing, as well as production and smuggling.
Before war broke out in Syria, major shipments of cocaine were delivered from Syria to Lebanon. The merchandise was imported directly from Latin America, then was brought here by road, or else it went through Jordan and Syria before reaching Lebanon.
I'd say the key new element is the direct link Hezbollah established between drugs and politics.
La drogue et la politique.
Drugs became a key source of financing. Maybe not for political activity, but for some security activities. This further developed while a Shiite diaspora was settling in some Latin American countries, which are known to be major hubs for this trade.
Hezbollah has got the global presence and the global contacts that al-Qaeda could only hope to have. It's important to understand that the Hezbollah, one of their strengths is their reliance on their diaspora around the world. They rely heavily on those communities, including right here in the United States. Many in those communities are heavily involved in the financial industry, banking industry, financial investment industry, and things like that. The Hezbollah taps into that. They tap into it very, very successfully, extremely effectively.
ورد عدة
There have been some exchanges between the units processing overseas financial intelligence and the Special Investigation Committee on money laundering operations in African countries and others you just named. And these documents mention some people's names, and some of them are thought to be Lebanese.
ممكن يكون من ضمنهم لبنانيين.
The
Lebanese-Canadian bank case showed that it is almost impossible to fight with Lebanese banking laws against Hezbollah without threatening the whole Lebanese banking sector. The Americans proved that they could sink that banking frigate which acted as a channel for Hezbollah money. But what happened next proved that it is not enough to sink a frigate to halt the Hezbollah fleet from operating in Lebanese waters and beyond.
D'opérer dans les eaux libanaises et au-delà des eaux libanaises.
It's one thing for us to understand, and we do clearly, that terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah have the ability to reach out to one another. It's something totally different when we stop to think that a member of the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb may already have the ability to reach out to a key leader within the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico and ask for a favor. That's a game changer.
La relation entre le Hezbollah
The relationship between Hezbollah and the drug trade starts in Lebanon, but doesn't end in South America. This is a two-way route. When Hezbollah protects the plantations in Lebanon, at the same time, one can see perfectly that Hezbollah is involved in businesses with the final product, especially cocaine, which is reintroduced to Lebanon.
In the 2 or 3 years after the 9/11 attacks, one of the great successes was that we were able to disrupt their funding. And without funding, a lot of the more ambitious terrorist attacks would not be possible. And I'm not sure that there will be any particular connecting when there is a terrorist attack at some point in the future, that there will be any argument that it occurred because not enough was done to disrupt their financing.
The war on drugs belongs to the past. The alliance of crime and finance has shifted the struggle. Having until now been caught on the back foot, it is up to states to find an answer to narco-terrorism.